Well, I am just so excited to have with us today an individual who I consider a friend who I've known for many years, but also an individual who has inspired me to look at my own job differently. And I was delighted that he, Dr. Rajiv Shah, actually put those ideas and those histories, which I now realize I only had a portion of. I had witnessed it over the years, but I didn't get the full. And that he put him this book, which let me put my Delta body pass down, in this perfectly titled book, Big Bets. Some of you have read it already. Others, I see you have now your copy. I really encourage you to look at it. And we just came back from a very quick round of conversations with just a sample of faculty, and it was very, very clear why this conversation is so relevant for us. So, Dr. Shah, Raj, welcome to Georgia Tech. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Angel. It's thrilling to be here, both at a great institution with amazing faculty and students, but also with you. We have been friends for a long time, and I'm so proud of what your whole institution is doing under your leadership.
Terrific. Well, let's sort of kind of cut to the chase and talk about big bets. Not only is the title of your book, it's also a term that in a way is shaping the narrative of the Rockefeller Foundation is. What is a big bet?
Well, I wrote the book because I feel like in so many elements of our work, when it comes to quote unquote doing good, we settle for good enough. We say, okay, this is work to address human vulnerability or to provide food to those who are hungry or to eliminate disease for those who are high risk of being infected and ultimately of perishing. We think of them sometimes as charitable endeavors, and we think if we can do some good, that's good enough to do, or that's good to do. And what I really have learned by working with you in different capacities, working with Bill and Melinda Gates when they started their foundation, watching President Obama and his team in a few different settings take on really big challenges and say, we're not going to settle for good enough. We're going to actually solve this problem. If 50% of the world's global birth cohort is not getting vaccinated and immunized from simple diseases, it may take 20 years, it may take $30 billion, but we're going to solve the problem of universal childhood immunization. If an Ebola pandemic is ravaging West Africa and threatening the rest of the world, we're not going to settle for what we can do. We're going to really study the issue, invent new solutions, engineer new solutions if required, and ensure that we beat back that pandemic in that geography before it spreads beyond that. And I try to trace in the book case studies of where I've been exposed to those types of big bets and then share what I've learned from watching others execute them.
So one, of course, you have always been part of organizations that have that capacity to impact, and then you help them really seize that impact. But Bill and Melinda Gates, arguably the largest philanthropy of our time. USAID, one of the largest aid organizations in the world. Now the Rockefeller Foundation, a legendary philanthropy. For the rest of us, what would you tell maybe students or faculty members who wish they can address those big bets, but who may find it overwhelming?
Well, first I would say, and I really reminded myself how much I believe in this when I wrote the book, which is institutions matter. If you look today at our statistics, young people in particular, but really all of society, have very low faith in our political institutions, in our government institutions, in our corporate institutions, and even in our university institutions, which now you see is suffering a similar loss of trust in many ways. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's an unfortunate outcome of a social media environment that feeds off of negativity when, in fact, it's people in institutions and entrepreneurs in institutions that end up changing the world. And so I'm a big believer that you all, especially those of you that are students, can be really change agents within whatever institutions you go to when you leave this great one. And I hope the book offers a bit of a playbook for how to do that. You know, I talk about when Bill Gates pulled us together for years, but weekly for years, to really study the global challenge of kids dying of simple diseases and not getting vaccinated. I mean, his methodology was deep inquisition, but his real methodology was asking an extremely simple question, probably 500 times in 18 months, which is, what does it cost to vaccinate a single child? And a lot of times the world's experts would gather at that table, and the answer would be, oh, you can't think of it that way. It's too complicated. You have human resources that have to be hired, roads that have to be built, cold chain that has to be developed. But ultimately, we kind of broke through that complexity, and that simple question gave us a simple answer, which was only partly right, but it was right enough to start on a 20-year endeavor that did raise tens of billions of dollars and that resulted in 980 million children being vaccinated and 16 million child lives being saved. And so I try to share stories and lessons I learned. But to me, especially when you're young and you leave university and you go into your first or second or third job, asking simple questions is a gift that we all tend to lose, you know, as we grow up professionally, and I hope you will retain.
Yeah, and there is an art to that, right? To really dig and get to the crux of a problem and trying to articulate what that unique question is. Let me ask you, because the other interesting thing about your background is you have been in private philanthropy, you have been in government, you've also been in business. And each type of institution can play a different role in finding a solution to one of these big bets, right? In a way, what is it that you think, what is the complementarity of these types of institutions, and why many times you've had to bring them all together?
Well, let me start just by saying, what are the core elements of the big bet, right? I think one is to say, look, we want to solve a problem, not just make an incremental or charitable improvement on the human condition. So that's at the heart of a big bet. But then I write about three core elements of a big bet. One is really finding those fresh, innovative solutions. We just saw the reinvented toilet for the world, but find those fresh, innovative solutions that can actually transform the lives of very, very large numbers of people. The second is building these really broad alliances that recognize that in the modern era, you know, it's unlikely that government's going to solve problems on its own, or businesses are going to solve problems on their own. Certainly philanthropies are not going to solve problems on their own. It's the stitching together of public and private, philanthropic and university. It's that collaborative approach that actually yields big outcomes. And I wrote about our big effort to address hunger and food insecurity after the 2008 food, fuel, and financial crisis pushed 100 million people back into poverty and hunger. That was a time when, if you opened up The Economist, there was a picture of a young girl in Haiti eating mud cakes. And mud cakes are exactly what you think they are. They are mud mixed with cereal grain in order to create a little more satiety for someone who's not getting enough food. In 2009, 2008, we're looking at these pictures. That solution to global food insecurity isn't going to come, and did not in the ensuing decade come from any one part of society. It came from President Obama saying, I'm going to create a program called Feed the Future, and I'm going to mobilize dozens of countries using the G20 summit to raise resources and political will to do something more serious about fighting hunger. It came from companies like Cargill that said, in the midst of a famine, I'm going to find one of my shipments and donate it in the port of Mogadishu, and helped us take down the excess child mortality from a famine in Somalia by a huge act of charitable commitment, but grounded in what they do best, which is move grain around the world with high efficiency. And it came from universities like Georgia Tech and Michigan State and Clemson and so many others around the world that said, we're going to reinvigorate our investments in the kinds of crop productivity improvements that will help farmers in Ethiopia that are growing in drier and hotter growing conditions, and will help farmers in Bangladesh, as you all are doing right now, have access to mechanized equipment in a more efficient way to improve their productivity. So it's all of us working together. The flip side of that, because it was public-private, because it had great universities and others, Congress on a bipartisan basis both passed the law, the Global Food Security Act, which was the second most significant global health and development piece of legislation behind the president's AIDS program, PEPFAR program, since World War II, or since the founding of USAID, really 60 years ago. But it also reauthorized that on a bipartisan basis under President Trump and then under President Biden. And it was that same legislative framework that was used to allow the Black Sea Grain Initiative to release grain from Ukraine and get into needy communities in Africa and elsewhere. So success is possible when people come together across those divides. And my message to young people is, as much as if you can build a career where you get exposure to the different things, those different areas, then you become a bit more conversant and able to stitch those alliances together as you sort of evolve your career.
One of the things I loved about your book is the fact that it's not just, hey, this is everything I've done right in my life. You're actually pretty open about this is how I screwed up and what I learned about it, which I thought was very refreshing. And in fact, you have a couple of stories about dealing with an increasingly polarized, politicized world, and how it sort of you change your approach. Any lessons that you think will be useful for the rest of us on how you also create those collaborations across the sort of political ideological divide?
Well, I'll tell you the story. When I was at USAID, my first experience in that job was leading the Haiti earthquake response on behalf of our country. And it was an extraordinary several months of real intense effort. We mounted the largest humanitarian response to the most deadly humanitarian catastrophe we'd faced as a country. But shortly thereafter, the Obama administration lost the Congress. And so we were now facing a Congress led by John Boehner and a budget crafted by Paul Ryan that had, in its first form, zeroed out USAID. It would have basically shut down all our programs. And it was called HR 1. It was the very first bill that was going to be passed. And so I was a former Gates Foundation person, kind of a nerdy spreadsheet kid in my heart. And so I said to my team, well, we're going to pull together all the information modeled with high rigor to explain the impact of shutting down vaccine programs, of no longer funding an antiretroviral pipeline for mother-to-child transmission programs, of pulling back bed net distribution in communities that have malaria. And I went up to Congress and I detailed the 70,000 kids we expected to die every year from basically retracting these programs. And I went through it in a lot of detail, and I got back to my office, and the headlines from that testimony said, Administrator Shah says Republican budget kills 70,000 kids. And I started getting phone calls, and a few came from the White House, and they were like, that's good. Finally, we got tough, and, good job, way to go. And then one of my former mentors and bosses, a gentleman named Tom Vilsack, who's now the Agriculture Secretary, was then as well, called me and said, Raj, I was just with Speaker Boehner, and he's very, very upset with your words. And he's been trying to build a faith-driven, Republican, conservative political coalition to reinstate the humanitarian funding, which he cares deeply about. And now you've made this big political thing, and you need to come up here and see him and apologize. So I said, okay, hustled up. I went to meet him. I did apologize. I met his chief of staff. They gave me a list of 30 or 40 members to really get to know over the next several weeks and months. And I started on that apology tour and got to know people, including the late Senator Johnny Isakson from this great state, and one of the most passionate humanitarian leaders and one of the most effective uh, bipartisan members of the Senate in promoting a role for America in the world where we promote our values by serving those who are vulnerable. I was honored to know him, but I got to know him during that period of time. And so the lesson for me is, I make a lot of mistakes. I write about them in the book. Apologize, learn from it, and move on quickly. I guess what I take away. Ultimately, that apology tour led to some of my closest and most meaningful friendships in the Senate and the House that really sustained our work over not just my tenure, but since I've left.
And what was interesting about reading and now hearing you talk about that experience is how much more effective we can be if instead of canceling the other who may disagree with you, you sort of listen and try to find the points of connection. So very, very powerful. Thank you for writing and telling that story. So let me ask you something else, bringing it closer. So Amor, all the things you've done, you still haven't been a college professor. We may be able to fix that after you're done with the Rockefeller Foundation, but so far you have not been. But you have, obviously, you're the product of great educational institutions. You have worked with universities and researchers in great universities. We've been asking ourselves that question here for the last 4 or 5 years, which is, as I mentioned, we're committed to developing leaders who advance technology and improve the human condition. We're proud we have the T word in our name. We believe in technology. We believe in technology because of the role he must play to solve big problems. We didn't use the term big bets, but in a way, I feel like that's what we were after. Yet, we're structured, our cultures kind of promote, let the 1,000 flowers bloom, professors follow their own interests, they find their own problems. Do you have any advice for us of how or at least maybe why should we try to make these big bets? I mean, it wouldn't be cool if Jordan said, we're going to try to focus on these 3-4 big problems.
Well, Hal, I think you already are very much leading the way on this around our country, but when we just heard from the roundtable, having this problem lens of saying, we exist as a community to both create knowledge, but then create that knowledge for the purpose of addressing big problems that exist in our society, huge inequities that tear us apart, tremendous vulnerability for climate change that will fall on the shoulders of the 2 billion people who suffer the most already today, and by the way, had almost nothing to do with contributing to carbon in our atmosphere and greenhouse gas emissions at scale over decades. So you have the ability in this university setting to take the technical excellence and the excellence in the humanities and other disciplines that unlock your creative juices and your intellect and apply them to solving problems. And if there's one message I hope people take away from the book is that these problems are actually solvable. It is, in 1861, President Lincoln signed the Morrill Act to create the land-grant university system. I don't know if Georgia Tech is a land-grant.
We're not.
It is, right?
Yeah, there's a college in Athens that have that.
Yeah, they might have that. But over about 50 years, that land-grant university system drove improvements in American agricultural production and productivity in a way that drove American competitiveness on the planet and put us in a position to benefit from the Industrial Revolution as it restructured our economy. If you look, to me, we're sort of on the front end of that transition now. And coming to Georgia is so exciting because what's happening in this state is very much the epicenter of the clean technology revolution. Jobs, power, manufacturing, science, technology, all coming together to shape the future. The question is, are you going to shape a future that solves the problems we face? Or are we going to shape a future that just serves the human desire for advancement and luxury and, optimizing for those who have plenty? And that's a set of judgments that's in your hands. You can invent energy storage solutions that change the economics of renewable electrification in very poor parts of the world. You can invent mobility solutions that would allow people who basically don't have access to modern mobility to be to have that tool in their toolkit as they try to move themselves and their families out of poverty. I can go on and on, but to me, this is a great institution to be a part of because you have the position to be problem solvers, and I think you already have that culture here baked in. So I'm optimistic.
So you said you could go on and on. I want us to go on and on. And in fact, I have so here's one of the things in trying to find what those big bets are. You can start in many different ways. One possible way, in the past, we used the National Academy of Engineering Grand Challenges. Now, more recently, we've been paying attention to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I have to say, the Rockefeller Foundation helped not just Georgia Tech, but a coalition of universities, the University Global Coalition, to start thinking about how to support the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are 17 goals that can inspire action. You, in setting up the strategy and the priorities for the Rockefeller Foundation, you also picked your own list, right? Give us a sense of what is the philosophy behind that list and any advice you have. I mean, you have health, food, power, economic equity, innovation, and finance, I believe. Yeah. How did you end up with that list? Any idea you can give us in terms of how Georgia Tech comes with our own list?
Let me, I'll answer that. I want to first just thank you for your leadership on the Sustainable Development Goals, because you've personally led that consortia that came together to say universities are the ideal place to adopt these 17 problems as a roadmap for both learning and contribution. And I was one of the many, many, many people around the world that helped negotiate those goals in 2015. And, at that point in time, the idea underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals is extremely straightforward. It is that we have it within our power. We have the resources, the technology, and the knowledge to help most people on this planet escape extreme poverty, experience the common basic dignity that comes with protection of your human rights and some basic opportunity for upward mobility. Including for women and girls all around the world. And we can do it in a sustainable way. That's it. That's what the Sustainable Development Goals are. Within that framework, we set goals for child survival. We set goals for maternal mortality. We set goals for energy poverty. But I'm a big believer that goal framework is not a political framework as much as it is a basic idea we should all kind of hold in our hearts and our minds, and it might get articulated in different ways, but it's that simple idea. So now, how did Rockefeller pick our priorities? We have for 110 years been founded and guided by a simple principle, and that is that we should find those areas of science and innovation that have the capacity to create the most human uplift over the long term. That's it. And when John D. Rockefeller and his advisor, a gentleman named Frederick Gates, wrote letters back and forth from 1903 to 1913 debating this idea. Their concept was, and this was, by the way, before the federal government collected income taxes. It was before any form of American government provided any social services to the vulnerable in this country. The basic idea was, can we find those areas where the application of science will have that human uplift? And they picked medicine and agriculture as the two big areas. And for 100 years, that was our primary areas of focus. And by the way, it led to Nobel Prizes in both sectors, the invention of the yellow fever vaccine, and then the ushering in of a green revolution that helped 800 million people or 1 billion people move off the brink of hunger through agricultural productivity gains. We now believe we're in a new era where energy technology and the revolution in energy technology makes it possible to finally end extreme poverty. And so that is our big bet. We've committed $500 million to one single project in that space, and then raised another 10 or 12 billion on top of that to be active in almost 22 countries around the world. But our goal is to reach 1 billion people who today live in the dark with renewable energy technology and with the tools and opportunities that come with it to create inclusive growth and make opportunity accessible to literally everybody. And, I can tell you more about it, but if you go to northern India into a village in rural Bihar, I can show you places where the Rockefeller team, working with companies and innovators locally, have built these solar mini grids, lithium-ion batteries, remote AI-based battery management, energy management systems, smart meters invented in Washington, D.C., and SMS text-based payment that was out of East Africa years earlier. And now we have a few million people who previously consumed almost no power, not enough power to power one light bulb and one small home appliance on an annual basis. Now they have jobs, they use power tools in their carpentry businesses. Women have electric sewing machines and train other girls to have a source of income. I visited a school where, frankly, only boys went to school during the day and it was shut in the evening, and now they have lighting. And so there's a whole second shift. Girls are now in school in the second shift, walk classroom to classroom, packed with girls eager to learn. It's a little hard for us to imagine because we have so much abundance here. But there are 1 billion people that live that way around the planet. We're now invested in projects that will reach 77 million of that billion with renewable electrification. And I'm convinced we'll reach the full billion over the next decade. But that's our biggest bet and our biggest priority.
That's a biggie, and I applaud you for taking the lead on that. Let me what you're doing today is actually helping us to really think self-critically about how we can approach those. We had a moment during COVID, which I know these moments happen in other places, where we all got together for a big bet. I guess this is in the category of the prospect of hanging concentrates one's mind beautifully. We had agreed to reopen in the fall of 2020, and all of a sudden we had to figure out how to do that in a safe way. We had no testing capacity, and yet we got together, and over 2 or 3 months we had set up our own PCR double pool testing system, software, logistics, and we went from zero to doing about 3,000 tests per day. The community came together without even having the possibility of requiring testing. Our community, our students showed up. We did give them a cookie and a sticker. Science works, y'all. That was the. But it was a moment where I felt, oh my gosh, this community come together on a big bet and we killed it. And then COVID was over and we're like, So we went back to our own devices. And the whole time I'm thinking, and as I was reading the book and hearing you, is like, wouldn't it be great to sort of, without the problems of a global pandemic, if we could just recreate those moments of, hey, these are the 3 bets we're going to go under. Help us, motivate us. I mean, you've already been.
Well, I would say this. First of all, congratulations on what you did with the testing infrastructure during COVID. America's inability to stand up a massive and rapid scaling of basic diagnostics at the beginning of the crisis cost us hundreds of thousands of American lives. And we're in Atlanta. We're blessed to have the best centers for disease control. That is the model for the rest of the world. And even then, we were unable to get testing right. Countries that had lived through it for SARS or H1N1, South Korea, New Zealand, even Germany, they were able to get it right. And they had a very different trajectory from a mortality perspective because of it. So what was, in my view, a government failure ended up becoming an area where Rockefeller, Georgia Tech, others had to step in and both create for our country a national testing strategy and infrastructure, and then just do it on your campus to show that it could be done. And it shows you the power of crisis to motivate in a positive way. And I saw that when I led the Haiti earthquake response. In a moment, 21 of 22 ministries in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, had collapsed. 250,000 people ultimately perished. The United Nations, which would lead a humanitarian response, was one of the buildings that had collapsed, and we lost many of our core partners in that effort. And I was about a week into the job at USAID when the president called and was like, Raj, I'm putting you in charge. And I thought, great. I was like excited, but then I was like, what do I do? And I'd say within hours, I started getting phone calls from across USAID around the world. A gentleman called from Peru and said, Raj, you don't know me, but I do earthquakes. I'm coming to help. Another one called from Afghanistan. He's like, Raj, you don't know me either, but I'm your best foreign service officer, and I'm going to be there tomorrow. It was just this outpouring of willingness and commitment. If you look back on that, this was in 2010. More Americans gave to the Haiti earthquake response. We set up an SMS text code where you could give a little bit. More American households gave to the earthquake response that year than watched the Super Bowl. And what does that tell you about human nature and about the American character? I mean, people want to be a part of things that are meaningful. Folks have values, and they want their lives to speak in a way that is impactful. So to me, crisis has always been a great opportunity to tap into that willingness to do something extraordinary. And I don't know how you do it when you don't have a crisis, but we have a crisis right now. We're living through a climate crisis. We're living through a crisis that is going to take about 1 billion additional people and push them into hunger and poverty across this planet if we don't do something more urgently. We're living through a crisis that will, dramatically reshape our access to food, our ability to be healthy, our ability to take and support the nations that kind of live on the brink of climate well-being. And it's not just small island states in the Indo-Pacific. It's also larger landlocked African countries that are looking at 30% reductions in food production and the ensuing migration from that. We saw a 5% reduction in food production, and that led to, in part, an Arab Spring and a huge destabilizing migration into Europe. And so, the right way to protect our planet, our people, our politics over the long term is to tackle the climate crisis with a sense of urgency. And I think you're doing that here. I'm proud of what I heard in the earlier session, but that's a crisis that I hope can mobilize that kind of energy and willingness and desire to contribute to building a better world together.
In a minute, I want to ask you to ask a few quick questions, and maybe we'll ask a few questions first, and then you can maybe connect them as needed. You can pick and choose or whatever. And while you think about those questions you might want to ask, did you really have to fly to West Africa in the middle of the Ebola crisis, and why? That sounded a little insane to me.
Well, I'll tell you, when I got back from that trip, I have 3 young kids, and they were younger then. And the parent group on the kids' soccer team was like, hey, we just saw Raj was just in West Africa and came back and was on CNN. Is he coming to the game this weekend? And it really wasn't an invitation. So she was like, are you sure you should come to the game? I'm like, yes, I should come to the game. I'm fine. But if you look back on that Ebola pandemic, in the summer of 2014, 7 out of every 10 people that contracted Ebola died. It's a hemorrhagic fever. People were bleeding in the streets in Liberia, in a city called Monrovia. And, 50% of the Liberian workforce had perished through contact and contagion. And so we were facing a tough situation. There were no humanitarian workers able to go in. There was no protective equipment and protocols and training to keep people safe. The CDC had just published a report saying we'd have 1.4 million cases of Ebola, including tens of thousands on American soil. And we were leading into the midterm elections, and it had become very political. And so President Obama in that setting made a big bet, and he said, we will, for the first time in American history, deploy U.S. troops to fight a disease. Sent 3,000 troops, built field hospitals, Ebola treatment units. And my job was to oversee the the humanitarian, the response on the ground. So yes, I had to go. And part of why I had to go was when we started that response, we didn't actually know what would work to reduce R naught or the level of contagion transmission. And the thing we thought would work were these Ebola treatment units, but if 7 out of 10 people are going to die, you go into these units, you never come out, your possessions never come out, your ashes never come out, and pretty soon, no one goes in. And so what ended up working was a local community solution. People discovered that it was in the washing and redressing and honoring the deceased, usually by family members and usually by girls. They were getting getting contaminated, and so they redid those cultural practices. They sent in these body bags and teams of people clad in protective equipment that would perform a ceremony, but then remove the body safely before it was cared for in the traditional setting. And we saw a steep reduction in transmission in that setting. And so ultimately, that was a big bet that did work. Less than 30,000 total cases, less than 11,000 deaths, only 2 cases on American soil, and not a single case of transmission in our country. I think because it happened around an election, we didn't get a lot of attention to that success story. But I tell it as a success story because I'm convinced big bets can work, and it's important to sort of study them and, in my mind, take on the next set of challenges.
Great questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jose Cabrera. My name is Julio Bade. I'm a 50 student of Science and Technology Policy in the School of Public Policy. One of the challenges we've been grappling with is the global coordination around the governance of artificial intelligence. You talked about building alliances, but sometimes that can be hard to do given diverging agendas. For instance, China, the European Union, and the United States. What do you think? And also, most of the conversations are focused on the global South, leaving out majority of the global North. What do you think can be done, or do you have any thoughts on how this kind of big bet situation can be resolved?
Yeah. I think that's an excellent question, and frankly, I think it's important for multiple reasons. One is, as AI evolves, as you know better than I do, the consequences, the tendency to discriminate, the realities of how it'll affect social media, misinformation, knowledge in any economy should be assessed, and there should be tools developed to address that. But also because over time, generalized AI can present a very different kind of threat. And I'm not expert enough to know how real that threat will be and over what time frame. But I have come to believe, and our team does some work in this space, I've come to believe that kind of the International Atomic Agency type of infrastructure is a bare minimum requirement. We need some sort of international institution. And I already said I believe in institutions that can communicate the threats and the opportunities that AI presents. You wouldn't obviously structure it the way the IEA is structured in order to be nimble and fast moving. It should probably be loosely networked into institutions like Georgia Tech and able to benefit from cutting edge thinking. But the world needs that kind of institution. We cannot just rely on, as much as I respect Sam Altman or anybody else, we can't rely on the inventors of the technology on their own to just talk about it, which is what we're doing right now. We also can't rely, in my view, on great public policy to regulate it in any meaningful time frame. So I think we need some kind of global institution that carries the force of the G7, the G20, and UN, but behaves in a much more loose, networked sort of way.
Sorry, question. Brett?
So thank you very much for the presentation so far. It's truly fascinating. Appreciate it. Thank you. So I wanted to explore kind of a segue to that as well. So, big bets need big teams, as you pointed out, so the ecosystems. But I was curious if you could explore with us, how do you set those up when you don't have a crisis? So a crisis is fantastic at eroding barriers, right?
Yeah,
people get motivated, but energy is not really facing a crisis. And I think that there's a lot of impediments there that might be commercial, it might be public policy. And so maybe that is an example, but more the bigger question is, how do you motivate, and what have you seen in your experience where you can motivate in the absence of a crisis?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. I don't personally feel I know the answer, and I really want to emphasize the value of crisis to bring, not just to bring people together, but to melt away the common things that keep us from being creative. In that Ebola situation, we did so many things that were technically not sanctioned by our CDC colleagues, but ultimately worked with the help of our CDC colleagues, because people were like, we just have to be creative in this moment because it was a crisis. So without knowing the answer, I can tell you what I try to do with our programs where we're building these big alliances. First is you have to be very, very clear about your goal. And it has to be measurable and observable, and you have to take data very, very seriously. So in the case of the Gates vaccine story, it was vaccinating every child on the planet, measuring that with rigor, tracking progress, and really staying with it for 20 plus years. We've launched our big bet to reach 1 billion people who live in energy poverty. I can tell you how the resources we've amassed are allocated against that goal. And we're trying to track against that goal in a way that's very quantitative, measurable, and specific. So I think that's number one. Number two is there are a set of mechanisms you can use that I write about in the book especially when you have people from different institutions working together. These sort of cross-organizational working groups that take on a life of their own, because ultimately people get more committed to the idea that, hey, I might work at the World Bank, but I'm a part of the Global Vaccine Alliance, and my purpose is to make sure every child gets vaccinated. Or, hey, I might work at DOD, but my purpose on this project is serving the humanitarian priorities in Haiti, and I'm part of that team. So I'm a big believer in those kind of cross-agency or cross-institutional. I mean, here you'd call it interdisciplinary institutes and the things you've already set up. The key is having a culture develop underneath it that because you can only draw boxes on a sheet of paper for so long, that where people feel like, hey, I might be a astrophysicist, but my purpose is to help, solve energy storage for a clean tech future. I'm making up an example that I think might apply here, but because you have astrophysicists and you do that kind of thing. So tapping into that sense of purpose is another big part of it.
Last question, and then you can also just wrap us up.
Hi, thank you for the conversation. My name is Beatriz Palacios. I'm a PhD student here in the School of Interactive Computing, and I work in a project on broadband equity in rural and tribal lands in the U.S., which is in part funded by Rockefeller Foundation, so thanks for the support. So I'm curious, you've talked about engaging with communities outside, like important problems outside of the U.S., but I want to hear your thoughts on engaging with problems locally within our communities.
Great question.
Well, first of all, thanks for what you're doing. It's so exciting that you're working on a project we help have something to do with. That's very exciting. I think we do a lot in the United States, starting, including the things we do on native lands, whether it was testing or broadband access or energy and electrification in communities that otherwise, believe it or not, still don't have access to affordable and business-friendly energy production and distribution. Our biggest effort in the U.S. is around economic equity. And so actually I'm going from here to visit some of our grantees in the Atlanta area that are Black and Brown-owned businesses and helping them get access to capital through financial systems partnerships with larger banks and CDFIs, these community development finance institutions. And so that's just a sample of what we do. Another big project in the U.S., which I'm very excited about, we call Food as Medicine. And if you look, last year in America, we conducted 130,000 amputations. 130,000 amputations for people with diabetes, more than in all of the U.S. wars we fought since Vietnam. And the idea that we allow our food system to make people sick and then amputate on the back end of that is really a very unfortunate way to treat a chronic disease. So we have been a part of these big efforts with the Health and Human Services and the American Heart Association to study the impact of targeted feeding programs, medically tailored meals, and produce prescriptions. And we found that some really effective impacts can be had by targeting certain populations and measuring results against hemoglobin A1C and other markers of prediabetes in high-risk populations. And I'm excited about that because our goal is to study the issue nationally in different cohorts, and then ultimately get insurance in the United States, public and private, self-employed and through insurance companies, to compensate and reimburse for dietary interventions for high-risk populations. And right now, because everyone's under pressure to pay for some very expensive weight loss drugs, there's a renewed interest amongst corporate leaders in this country to find ways to pay for other ways to keep their workforce healthy. So we're going to, I think, make some big progress in that space as well. And so by way of just concluding, I'll say thank you very much for having me. I'm a huge fan of your presidents, and you're very fortunate to be at an institution that both brings all the technical excellence you bring and that were evident in the questions and comments, and the spirit of problem solving that we heard about in the roundtable earlier, and that I know you, Angel, have really represented no matter where you've been. And I think we as a country are going to rely more and more on the Georgia Techs of the world to bring not just the solutions to our problems, but the sense of humanity and purpose in applying those solutions to create a better country and better world. So it's very exciting to be with you. I hope you enjoy the book. And we have on our website something called the Big Bets Community. So if you're in particular a student who wants to do this type of work, please go to rockfound.org. You can sign up for the Big Bets Community. The goal over time is to provide fellowship opportunities and access to grants and access to partners, so that if you want to do this type of work in the future, you feel like you have a place where you can get some help on that journey.
Fabulous. Please join me in thanking Raj Shah for the incredibly inspiring talk. Thank you so much.